Hello. Hey everyone, this is Spacetown again. I am finally getting to that track breakdown I kept saying I was going to do. We're going to do a breakdown of the track Dusk that I created for Open Oscillator and then expanded on that you have seen on YouTube, hopefully. And if you haven't, you can go watch it on YouTube. It's the track in its entirety. I will be playing elements of that track in here, but if you want to hear the whole thing as it's supposed to be, go watch that YouTube video. There's also some cool visuals that I made for it. I'm not going to go over the visual component right now because I'm still developing my workflow and I don't feel entirely comfortable talking about the visuals yet. I don't know if I'm at a replicable workflow, so I'm just going to hold off on it. But if you have any questions about how the visuals were made or what tools I used or whatever, feel free to say so in the comments and I will consider making videos about them, or at least just respond in the comments with information about that stuff. But there are much better visualists than me, and I am mostly going to be talking about the music production here. So this track, Dusk, was inspired by the track Augment by Darko and Fate. I've been a big fan of Darko for a really long time, and so where his current music is now is very video game inspired, very cinematic. It incorporates a lot of ravey synths and rave styles into this alternate video game reality universe that I really enjoy. So I heard that track, and at first this track was supposed to be almost a wholesale ripoff of it, mostly to develop my own skill in the MA and try to figure out how to compose more dense and more complex structures in the M8 without, actually needing to come up with something myself. So the first riff that I started off with was this one here. So it's this piano part, this kind of trancey synth part, and then the bass line. That was essentially the entirety of the first riff that I composed and was the foundation of the track. A little bit of a background into my composition process. I like to start off with a riff and then layer things onto that riff until I create what's called a super loop. I call it a super loop. Some people may call it a hyper loop, but I think that one of those is much more useful than the other. And with this super loop, that represents the maximum intensity and energy that the track wants to get to, right? But this is what I do to kind of combat the problem of getting into the loop problem. I think this has been talked about by a bunch of other people, but there's usually a problem when you're creating music on hardware where you get into a loop, right? You build out a loop that is essentially 16, 8, 4 bars, right? And that's where you are, right? You're just stuck there and you don't really have any idea about how to progress the track or how to expand on it. And so the way that I usually get around that problem is when I create that loop, right, the super loop, I start by imagining that as the maximum intensity, and then I start removing elements from that in order to create what's essentially my intro. And then when I have my intro, I start re-adding elements back into the track to get back to the peak that I created earlier. So the super loop ended up being something like this, and this isn't the real super loop I have here. It's mostly just something that I was messing around with in like the sketchpad portion of the project. So yeah, so it goes on for 16 bars, and that is the maximum intensity that I wanted to get to. And so by stripping it away until I get back to my first riff, I've created the intro of the track, right? So with Dusk, I have these first two rows as the intro, right? Or the intro to the first peak of the track. With these first two rows, I have my first original riff here. I always intended it as the beginning part of the song when I wrote the riff, So that was a really natural place to start. The second row is essentially just introducing this angelic, patty, rhythmic thing up here, this one. So introducing that to create a little bit more interest and kind of hook people in to where we end up going. Okay, I'm gonna stop it there because so this third row we have here is essentially the first peak, right? I used to create tracks. It was a intro, breakdown, build up, one peak, and then ride that peak out to the end of the track, right? I have started, it was a really simple song structure, but it allowed me to make a really long build up, something kind of like a trance song, right? Where you usually have like one big build up in the middle of it. But I noticed that a lot of trance tracks have what's called like kind of a, it's not called it, I just call it this, a mini summit in the middle of it where it kind of keeps the energy going and progresses the song without essentially playing all of your cards in that first part, right? It progresses the song, keeps the song moving, keeps interest in the song, but then it allows you to kind of go different places with it. So this third line, this third row represents that first peak. So this is where we're building up to initially. So that's the first peak. We end up there from essentially the intro. And from this peak, I can either make it go higher or I can go lower. In this case, I chose to go lower with the song structure to essentially build up again and make an even bigger release at the end of the track. So from this third row, I kind of drop the energy back down, bring the filter cutoffs back into their lower settings, and essentially create this a second build up for the rest of the track. Right. I take out the percussion, bring everything back down, and then we start building up again with the reintroduction of the kick drum. So that's what the kind of breakdown and build up section is, and then after that it's essentially just full on maximum volume, ready, like maximum intensity and energy, just go 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 with the break pattern that's introduced and the introduction of the main lead part at its most intense. So here's the release at the end of that build up. Okay, so once I let that write out for 2 rows, right? Essentially 32 bars, because we get to that peak and then I can add a little bit more interest in the second version of that build of that release, right? So in the first one, we have essentially 2 tracks that aren't being used right now. The second one and this fourth one. The second one is handling a lot of my kind of miscellaneous samples and like percussion things, because I'm in this section of it, the track that I normally use for my percussion is being taken by the break that's playing. So I put it on the second one, and then the fourth one is just not being used. But then when I redo this, when I kind of reintroduce this release part, this big buildup, I change the bass line so that it maintains the the interest. And then two, I add a couple more elements that are represented by the second and fourth tracks here. So let's listen to this first peak, and then we'll listen to the second one after. So as you can hear, it's basically just that lead line that's playing. And most of the interest, right, most of the increased activity, the increased energy, is handled by both the kick drum and the introduction of the break pattern that's providing a lot of energy and driving the track forward. So if I mute this part, right, it's not that much happening, right? So I wanted to provide a lot of room for that lead part. Once we've established that that lead part exists and we're kind of getting used to hearing it, and it might become a little boring if I just let it ride out for another 16 bars, I introduce these two sections here. So let's listen to that second part. So what I'm doing there is, one, again, changing the bass line to keep interest in the track and make it not sound quite the same. And then two, introducing the parts on the fourth track and the second track that kind of add a little bit more interest as well. And then from that, I have to end the track somehow, right? So normally what I do is just kind of slowly strip away elements until I get to the ending parts and then just kind of let it play out there. But in this case, I actually decided I wanted to just reuse that buildup that I had building up to that second peak. So when I came back to the end of the track, we essentially have the same thing that happens on the build up to the maximum intensity part. But in this case, it sounds like it's going to go to some high intensity part, and then it just ends with the piano line. So that's kind of a breakdown of the track structure, how I planned the track and how I wanted things to progress and move. And so we'll get into the individual chains and instruments in a little bit, but I wanted to give a sense of what this track breakdown, what the song structure is, so that you can kind of understand what's happening with the instruments and why I made the particular organizational decisions that I did when I was writing the tracks. Now, let's get into the actual tracks and instruments themselves. Similarly to my techno projects, I like to keep my instruments and instrument types kind of confined to one channel so I don't lose track of what's happening as the song is progressing. It keeps it easier to organize in my mind. The beauty of the MA is that you can essentially throw any instrument into any channel and make it sound good. And have, a bunch of different instruments in the same channel and have them all play. But I find that I tend to get lost organizationally, and I reuse a lot of instruments when I'm composing after I've created them. So if I wanted to, say this like piano part, right? If I started using the piano part in my fifth track over here, that piano instrument would be subject to all of the effects and the leveling that I'm doing on this fifth track. And two, any changes that I make to that piano while I'm messing it around with it here in the fifth track will then change the piano part in the first track. So to avoid that kind of cross-contamination of the project files and instruments and things like that, I like to kind of separate by track. So yeah, let's get into the tracks themselves. The first track is my piano track. It doesn't do anything different from piano the entire time, and most of it is taken up by this chain, which is essentially 0-0. It is playing this pattern on a loop the whole time, and so it's not that interesting. So it's really not a super interesting track. It's playing that on a loop basically the whole time. What's maybe more interesting is the piano sound. So the piano sample is actually one of the rare presets I actually do use, and it's mostly because I don't want to have to deal with changing the settings over and over again, and actually like setting the slice point and setting the sample every single time. The sample itself are these wave files of a piano being played at every key at different velocities. And so when we look at this, if we look at this sample, right, it's super long, and it's every piano tone played and ringing out for a really long time, right? And so this was actually posted on the M8 Discord. I'm sure if you look for piano samples, you can find it on there. But what happens is if you slice it in a way that allows you to separate it into all of the different tones that are being used, right? So there are 85 tones in the piano sample, and so that's why you're slicing it 85 times. Then what ends up happening is that when you slice it that way, you can actually start playing tonally with the piano sample. Right, so that's the main interesting part about this instrument. Then I took the sample, the piano sample, and I just ran it through a bunch of chorus and delay and reverb to make it sound all interesting. And then I did a little bit of the amp to make it distort just a tiny bit to give it a little warmth when I play it. So that's the piano sound. Moving on to the second track. This track is the accompaniment to this first piano part. This was the second thing I wrote with this first riff. So these two tracks are meant to complement each other the whole time, right? And this is what the foundation of the song was for me, were these two playing at the same time. The instrument is created out of just a typical saw swarm patch that I make basically every time I use the saw swarm. It's your generic super saw, trancy sound. No delay on this, bunch of reverb, bunch of chorus, throw it through the amplifier to get a little bit of distortion and warmth. The low pass setting, I have it on a low cutoff, but in the envelope, I actually have a cutoff envelope so that you get that kind of that movement of the cutoff as it's playing, and then a short volume, right? So what it sounds like individually should be, right? So it's kind of like a quick little trancy thing that will complement the piano. But what I also did was, because I wanted to give this a lot more movement, I was messing around with the delay settings to get it to repeat itself and give it some more movement without this retrigger over here, right? So if we just listen to this without the retrigger, it's cool, right? It sounds okay. With the piano, it sounds okay too. And then even with the bass. But I feel like there could be a little bit more activity here. It's just a little bit too spare for me in terms of the sound that's happening, right? So what I decided to do is actually add this retrigger command in the table as opposed to in the phrase. Because I didn't care when it happened, I just wanted it to happen every time. The retrigger is timed out so that it's essentially playing an eighth note, when it's playing. So and that creates a lot more movement. It makes it much more interesting. You could get rid of this retrigger and just put it here, right? Just repeat the note over and over again in the phrase itself. So let's try that and see what it sounds like. right? It's going to do the same thing. So it's not really anything different than just having it repeat as a note in the phrase. This is just a cleaner way for me to do it, because for me the intent is to have these initial notes be the kind of grounding tones that exist in the track, right? So having it just exist on the eighth notes of the phrase as opposed to 16th notes, it, to me mentally, it makes more sense to do it this way. It might not make as much sense to you, but that's okay. You can do it either way and it'll sound the same. So then put together, right, the piano and the kind of first instrument that we have here. So that's the main riff that I came up with, but then there's no movement to the phrase, because in both the piano part and the synth part that we have here, there's no changing of the root note. I'm not changing the pattern here to kind of give the phrase a little bit of movement. That's being handled by this bass tone over here, right? Right? You can hear the bass changing its note. And so when it changes, that's what gives this whole thing its movement in the song. It's always important to kind of think about the way that you want to move and progress the song. One of the easiest ways to do that is to just change the bass note of whatever pattern you're doing, right? You can go from your 1 and then to your 7 and 6. You can go 1, 3, 6, or whatever, however you want to do it. But changing the bass note adds a lot of progression to the song, moves the song into a place that you actually, it gives the song more momentum as opposed to just having this, right, playing over and over and over and over again. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but essentially with this instrument, the main tweakable parameter that I wanted to play with in the rest of the song was the cutoff, right? That's the only thing that I'm really changing up here. And with the saw swarm, it has a very dense and warm sound as you open the cutoff of any low pass filter on it. So this is something I play with all the time in my trancey tracks. And I spend a lot of time in that aforementioned super loop just messing with various filter cutoffs and kind of opening them up and then closing them again to listen to what it sounds like if that filter is opened. So if I'm playing this and I'm just, it sounds good in both settings, right? It sounds good in the closed setting or the more closed setting, and it sounds good when the filter cutoff is opened up. I think that that's like really important to test out when you're making this kind of track that relies a lot on opening and closing a filter cutoff to kind of expand and contract the energy of the song. It's important that your instruments sound good in both settings, so when the cutoff is open and when the cutoff is closed, because often what you'll find is that it'll sound good open, but then when you want to build to it, you can't bring that instrument closed, and so your starting point is way too high energy, and then when you build up to what you want to build up to, it doesn't sound like as much of a build-up because your starting point is so close to your ending point. Or vice versa, you have something that sounds really good with this, like it sounds like, oh man, there's a lot of potential here when I open up the cutoff, and then when you do open up the cutoff, it sounds tinny, it doesn't sound very good, and so it's important to get the instrument settings right first for this kind of track so that when you do open up that cutoff, it actually sounds good in both settings. So that's the main tweakable parameter. It starts here, right? So it's essentially that same pattern over and over again, and all I'm playing with is the filter cutoff, and then in the high intensity peak that I have, I am bringing up the pattern by an octave to give it even more energy. Yeah. A quick note about these extra little, for the piano part, I have the same chain the entire time. For this synth part, I have these 11s that are happening right here. This is one of the ways that I kind of build up my intensity as I'm like moving into different parts of the song. I will have a chain that starts off with its first 8 bars usually with the same thing that the previous chain had, right? So it's just 10 phrases of 10. And then the first 8 of these phrases are also 10, but then you'll notice I add these additional phrases here, right? If we get into these additional phrases, it's essentially the same tones, right? The same tones, I'm just going to go down through them, right? The tones are all staying the same, the instruments all the same, everything's the same. But what you'll notice is that I am adding a cutoff change in the FX part of the phrase, right? And so this is how I kind of slowly progress a filter cutoff, is I do it in the effects part of the phrase. So if we're down here, everything's going to stay the same over time. But as we move into the second part of the chain, it's going to slowly open up that filter cutoff. So that's how I kind of construct my buildups, is I will have a chain that will have a portion of the previous chain, and then once I want to start building up that energy, opening up the filter cutoffs, changing parameters over time, I start doing so in the FX parts. You can kind of think of this as like an automation curve for a tracker, right? Where this is where you're going to be changing things and making things happen over time, so that you don't have to manually be in here changing the cutoff as you play out the song. I used to do that in some of my older songs. I actually have myself changing the filter cutoff off screen so that I don't have to write it all in here. But at some point I decided it was easier to just have everything so that I could just hit play on the song and have everything work, as opposed to doing it myself and having it sound super good or whatever. So that's what I'm doing in the second track. In this third track, this is my main lead part. This is the biggest, most audible part of the whole song for me. I need it to kind of be louder than everything else, and kind of ring out the most. So when I made the instrument, I'm using the same saw swarm that I did before. And I don't know why I called it anything. I don't usually save these, but I guess I decided I was feeling funky and I wanted to name this for some reason. I even spelled it wrong too. That's cool. So same saw swarm. This is my default swarm patch that I like to make. But in this case, I really threw it through the amplifier, right? Normally my amplifier is like down here. But in this case, I wanted it to be big. So I wanted to like bring a little bit more amplifier into it so that I could kind of like hit the limiter more and bring out some of the character of that limiter. Same thing with the chorus reverb, pretty big on both. Low pass filter with a filter cutoff envelope that is going relatively fast. And then the main change that I did here was to add a vibrato in the table section. For the vibrato, the first digit represents the speed of the vibrato, and the second digit represents the depth of the vibrato effect. So I decided to make it super, super fast, right? To almost make it feel like it wasn't a vibrato, just like introducing a lot of natural character to the synth itself. And then I put it at a relatively large rate, or a relatively large depth for this effect, right? If I got rid of this, you can listen to what it'll sound like without this, and you'll see that it sounds a lot a lot less, it has a lot less character in it. Right, so when we add this back in, it gives this kind of like scratchy, a little bit dirty, funky effect that adds a lot of activity, energy, you know. And then if I wanted to even increase it more and make it a little bit more atonal, I could, right? So, right. So this vibrato is pretty nice to give a little bit of crunchiness, a little bit of grit to what would otherwise be a relatively clean sounding synth. And everything stays relatively tonal with this vibrato. There is actually a section called or a command called vibrato extreme where you can get things super atonal if you want them to, but in this case I didn't want things to go atonal. I just wanted to introduce a little bit of like a grit and a energy to it. So that's what the instrument is. And then again, as is the case with most of my instruments, the main parameter that you can tweak is the cutoff, and actually, yeah, that's the only one. So sounds good in both settings, right? I like it down here, I like it down up here. And so that's the main thing. I think I also do some stuff with, yeah, so I also bring out the decay of both the volume and the cutoff envelopes to give it a lot more length to the note individually as I'm playing with it. And that only happens in these big summit parts, right? Up here, it's just, oops. Up here, it's just, it's still loud, it still has a lot of character, but I leave room for it to get even more intense, right? Which happens up here. Right, so the cutoff is higher on these ones. The decay for the first table is higher, and also the decay for the second table is higher. And you can actually see that in here, right? I'm bringing the decay out quite a bit on both. And so that allows the instrument to really ring out and have a lot of energy and a lot of things to say for this high intensity part. That's the instrument for the third track. Fourth track, I have this kind of interesting rhythmic part that's very busy. It's not meant to be something that is really paid attention to. It's kind of meant to add a little bit of like background activity to areas that might need it, right? So without this part, so this row here is my kind of breakdown and build up row, and it happens after the first peak, right? So we're at a high intensity moment. Everything is like, it sounds like it's about to get going and go high, you know, go pretty hard, but then I want to bring it down a little bit, right? And so when I was writing this part, right, when I was writing this section of the song, I did it without this like element here, without this track. And so, you know, there was something, it was nice, it felt okay, right? It didn't feel like it was that bad, but I kind of realized like I wanted a little bit more energy and a little bit more activity in this to really sell this breakdown a little bit more, right? And I also wanted to differentiate it from the previous sections a little bit, because what if I don't have this chain here on the fourth track, then we will essentially have had 1, 2, 3, 4 rows of music where I'm playing the same 2 or 3 chains the whole time. So what this chain and this instrument is meant to do is add yet another element of a song to kind of like, oh, that's something I haven't heard before. And it's going to keep my interest as I progress into this new build-up and higher energy thing, right? So what I'm doing here is a instrument made out of the morph shape for the macro synth. With this, I just played around with the timbre until I found something that I liked. Right? So with the morph part, I actually wanted to have less of a like a 50% pulse width sound and more of like a tinny, a little bit more gritty. So that's why I put the timbre up here. Put it through the amp, chorus reverb, no delay, because when you're when you're playing 16th notes, delay doesn't usually add too much. It actually just kind of pollutes and oversaturates the delay. Same thing with a low pass cutoff. And then I have just a very short little envelope and cutoff filter. I'm also doing something with the timbre of the instrument in the LFO portion. So I'm changing the timbre very slightly, very quickly every time as the pattern is playing, because I wanted it to have a lot of different changes. I wanted it to have a lot of like activity and energy behind it, as opposed to the other ones where there's energy there, but I wanted those to kind of like ring out and say what they wanted to say in a really big and loud way. In this one, I wanted it to be kind of like a little bit more chattery, a little bit more quick and nimble. And so what I'm doing here is I'm trying to add a lot more activity to the timbre. If I get rid of it, right, it still sounds okay, but the timbre adds just a little bit more activity to the character of the sound that I like. And I do the same thing with the panning. I actually have this done twice for some reason. I don't know why I did it. I'm doing it kind of similarly for both. And then I also have the same thing that I did with the vibrato in the previous in the previous instrument. I have this vibrato setting. In this one, I decided to use the extreme setting, and then I set the amount only to 2, right? So without this, it sounds a little bit too normal, right? It sounds a little bit too like a normal synth. With the vibrato, it adds just the tiniest bit of grit to the actual instrument that allows the instrument to have the intended effect of like being a little bit more like chattery and quick and nimble. I also add the slides here. The slides are important because it makes it so that the cutoff envelope doesn't sound exactly the same for every trigger of the instrument. And that's important because when you have an instrument that's triggering as many times as it is per phrase or per bar, it's really important to make sure that it doesn't get too samey in the listener's mind if you're trying to have an effect of like, oh, this is random and kind of going all over the place. So I got rid of the slides, right? And this is what it sounds like without the slides. So that panning effect is still going off, right? But without the slides, it sounds like you're definitely hearing the same filter cutoff happening over and over and over again, right? And not to say that adding a slide changes the filter cutoff, but what it does is it actually gives you a different effect on that filter cutoff every time, because the distance between tones is not the same for every single the tone, right? What a slide does here is it essentially will slide from one tone to the other at a specified speed. So I have it at a really quick slide, but because the notes, the tones themselves, aren't the same distance between each other, right? The G is only one semitone away from the F sharp, but the F sharp is many semitones away from the B, which is a number of semitones away from the G. What this is doing with the slide, it is essentially adding another almost random element to the beginning of the note that makes the filter cutoff sound different, even though I'm using the same filter cutoff envelope for each triggering of the note, right? So without the slide again, you can hear that little like that attack of the note has the same right. With the slide, now it's become a lot more interesting and a lot it's changed a lot essentially. That coupled with the panning, because I wanted to have a random panning for this instrument just because I wanted it to not to surprise you and not really give you a sense of where it's coming from. All of this combined creates a kind of interesting effect for this, right? So that's the fourth track and the fourth instrument. Again, the main parameter is the cutoff. I'm changing the cutoff and then some of the decay. So in the big build-up section, this is what it sounds like. And it even sounds like it's cutting off some of those tones just because of the way that the slide and the cutoffs work and stuff like that. So this is I meant for the cutoff to be the main tweakable parameter because that will allow me to utilize these effects tracks to get to from one intensity to another intensity using only one parameter. So that is the fourth track, which is like a rhythmic energy track that kind of does a lot of background work for the song, right? It's especially evident in this portion of the song, right? The second repetition of that main peak. Right? Without that, right, it sounds very similar to the first repetition of it, even though it's using a different bass line. So if we move from that to this one, I'm adding in another element here, right? I'm using that element that I had introduced before, but it still sounds too similar to the opening parts of the song, right? But if I add this section back in, right? If I kind of start A-Bing it and like muting it and unmuting it, let's listen to it. It's pretty subtle, but you can notice when it leaves, right? And when it does leave, it kind of drops the intensity and the energy of the track down in a way that I don't really want it to, because this is supposed to be like the main climax of the track, right? And I'm adding to what's already a climax, so that's why I like having little sections like this in a track. They don't seem to add much when you listen to them in context or in its whole form, but it does a little bit of the dirty work in terms of adding character and energy to a piece. Fifth track, pretty boring. It is my bass track. This is the big bass track. It is just a very large bass made out of the saw swarm. Low passed down to this cutoff, and again, cutoff is the main parameter that I'm tweaking here. A little bit of chorus, a little bit of reverb. I don't usually put reverb on my bass tracks, but here I wanted it to be kind of like woomphy. I wanted to have a lot of like woomph to it, so adding that reverb allows you to capture some of that like higher frequency material that you don't usually have in a bass track and amplify it. So this is what the reverb is there for. Very simple instrument. I don't think I'm even doing anything on the envelopes page. So, yep. So with bass instruments, I find that when you're using saw swarm, the main character building thing that you can change is the limiter type. because you'll always want it to have the amplifier go up, right? You'll always want the amplifier to kind of like hit the limiter at some point. But the character of the bass really depends on the kind of limiter that you're using. So if I bring this, right, I'm playing this one out, you can hear like a little bit of distortion, like it's distorting just a little bit, but not enough to be like this crazy big thing. But if I bring it back down to like the clip, right, the clip limiter, it is much harder to get that distortion going, and it's much harder to get that distortion sounding like a big intense bass track, right? Sine, I don't use sine or fold that much rap. When I get to post, you can really hear that the bass is hitting the limiter in a way that makes it sound nice. So that's what I mean when I'm saying that the limiter is the main thing that really defines the character of the bass when you're, one, using a low pass filter, and two, using saw swarm. I think in that order. So if you're trying to figure out a nice big bass instrument to use and you're having trouble making it sound gritty or dirty or whatever, try changing the limiter type. That usually helps a lot. And then I'm not doing anything very interesting with the bass here. It's literally just changing the bass line at some point for the build-up climax thing. Over here we have my on the 6th track I have what I'm calling my like Angelic rhythmic pad thing. It's a weird name for an instrument. Let me just play it and you might be able to hear what I'm talking about. So this is an instrument and a track that is not exactly a pad, but it's intended to have a pad effect, right? I feel like if it's just a pad and we don't have the repetitions of this and the repetitions of the cutoff envelope, then it kind of blends into the rest of the track in a way that's a little bit too much, where we lose this. And one of the tips I have, one of the things that I like to pay attention to when composing in the M8 is making sure that you're actually using the track, and that the track is making meaningful additions to the rest of the song, right? I don't quite follow that with the piano part, but one of the things that I like to do is test out, right? If I'm playing something at maximum intensity, right? And if I remove one of the tracks from it, does it change the character, the vibe of what's playing, right? If it doesn't, to a meaningful degree, then you can safely remove that track and use it for something else that will add to the character. That's a really important thing to kind of always be considering as you're working in this tracker, because you only have 8 tracks, right? So a lot of tracker usage is making sure that you're getting the maximum out of every single track that you're using. That said, if the song that you're making doesn't require it, then you don't need to, be this diligent about it. But if you're trying to go for a really big, dense, complex sound, it's really important to make sure that you're maximizing every single track that you can be maximizing. So that's why with this, if it was just one long note, it would blend into the rest of the track too easily, and I found that I could just remove it and it wouldn't do anything to the character of the track. But I still wanted this kind of angelic-y, like this high notes that would be playing, and that kind of represents the higher EQ, the higher like frequency parts of the track, to give that area a little bit of energy, but without getting in the way of everything else. So that's why I have it set up so that it's, instead of having one note, I have it playing on 16ths, but I'm changing the velocity of it every time it plays, and I also have a filter cutoff envelope for every time it plays. instrument itself is, again, super simple, same sauce form that I always do, with the timbre at 80, the color at 20, low pass with a cutoff that's fairly low, and a little bit of the amplifier up. Chorus and reverb always, and yeah, that's the sauce form. So the main thing that I want to go over with this track is this velocity thing that I'm doing here, right? I'm going from 44 velocity to 74 velocity, and then repeating that 4 times over the course of the 16-step phrase. What this does is it's essentially faking a sidechain without actually needing any kind of sidechain input. And the thing with the sidechain faking is that it's not actually even faking it correctly, right? Because if I were to really fake a sidechain, I would have to go into my drum area and figure out when the drum hits, and then have the volume or the velocity go up from each drum hit step, right? But in this one, I just decided to do it on the down, on 4 on the floor, right? So that it goes from 44 to 74 evenly across the course of the 16 steps. So if we look at this, right, and if we kind of just set it at 74 the whole time, right, let's listen to this and see what it sounds like. And then if we kind of put it back into the context, it's too loud, right? It really sits in the mix way too loud. But let's bring it down, right? If we bring it down to like 44, right, then it's too soft, right? And we can find a velocity that this works at. Right, so maybe 54 it works, right? But the problem here is that it's just not generating enough interest in itself to justify its use in the song. But if I do a, if I add this velocity sidechain fakery thing, right? The fact that it's kind of moving, the volume of this instrument is moving over the course of the phrase, gives this enough interest for me to justify using it in the rest of the track. I'm kind of trying to emulate a lot of the old trance effect of like having a high repeating note that isn't trying to draw attention to itself, but like it kind of anchors the sound up there. And then when I have it out here, right, you're not hearing any kind of volume envelope, right? It's all in the cutoff envelope. But when I bring it out into the big climax moment, even if the cutoff is much higher, having the velocity there still gives this track a lot of movement as it's playing out. So that's the 6th track. 7th track, it is my kick drum, the big kick drum thing that's happening here. So this track was always meant to be a kick drum, and with the kick drum I wanted it to be big and intense and distorted and kind of almost like overload the track as it's playing out. So I also wanted it to play nice with the kind of sustained bass note. And something that helps a lot when you're trying to just do everything in the M8 is when you have something like this where you have a big bass kick drum and a big bass note, and the kick drum needs to be tonal, using the limiter to great effect. Using the limiter will help a lot. And then making sure that your track levels are such that the limiter will actually do its job allows you to kind of get this nice interplay between the low end of the kick drum and the bass. Right, so the kick drum really takes over for the first part of it, but if we actually listen to the kick drum itself, it's not an endless note, right? It will fade to 0 in terms of volume eventually. right? And it doesn't stay audible for very long. Which is why I decided that it was okay to leave both the bass and the kick drum playing at the same time, because I didn't want the bass to go away after the kick drum happened, right? I didn't want the kick drum to be the entire bass line. If we do, we can kind of try that out here, right? If I get rid of the bass, this is what it sounds like with just the kick drum as the bass line, right? And so you really lose a lot of that like bass energy if the kick drum is the only thing sustaining that bass. And then you might say, oh, well, why don't you just make it so that the volume LFO isn't there, right? And it's just holding on to that volume the whole time. But if I do that, then the bass stays too high up in the mix for me to use this as the main bass line, right? Because I wanted the kick drum to be such a huge presence in the track, and I wanted it to like kind of dominate everything every time it hit. I had to set the track volume to very high, right? It's the highest in the entire track. I mean, it's the highest level in the entire song, right? But because of that, if I let the kick drum ride out for its entire time, then it's overwhelming the rest of the song, even without the second bass line. So if we listen to it right here. Right? One, the bass isn't moving very much, so it just kind of stays there and doesn't do anything for a really long time. Two, it's so high up in the mix that it's kind of overriding a lot of the other things that are playing out. And because we have the limiter set up and we have the kick drum set so high, a lot of the movement in the other parts doesn't get to happen. So that's why I have the volume set up so that the kick drum doesn't stay up so high. And then we can utilize this other bass line to, one, give it movement, and two, keep the bass line there, but not in a way that overwhelms the rest of the track. I thought that was the nice happy compromise between all of it. The instrument itself, I'm using a seesaw shape for the macro synth. Brought the color down to 30. Fairly simple, like a low cutoff on the low pass, lots of chorus, and I'm, again, because this is a bass tonal bass line, I'm synthesizing this kick drum as opposed to using a sample because I wanted it to have a tonality to it, instead of having it just like be a kick drum and then the bass, the rest of the bass picks it up later on. High amplifier with a post limiter, and then I'm doing a lot of work in the envelope table for this kick drum. Again, one of the easiest ways to turn a synthesizer part into a kick drum is to add a pitch envelope. The pitch envelope will have a fast decay and it will be over a large amount, right? So without this pitch envelope, if I just... right, the cutoff envelope is still doing a little bit of work, but it definitely doesn't sound anything like a kick drum, right? The kick drum sound is made by having a super high pitch go to a super low pitch really quickly. So that's with the pitch, without the pitch. Added a cutoff envelope because without the cutoff envelope you miss a lot of the high frequency material energy that you get. So if I get rid of this, right, now you get the thumpiness of the pitch envelope, but you don't get the sonic energy, the timbre energy of the kick drum here. So that's why the cutoff is necessary. And then with that, I run out of envelopes to use for the volume envelope, so I kind of had to jerry-rig a volume envelope with this LFO part. The LFO is controlling the volume. I have it set to ramp down on every time it plays, and it's going to go relatively quickly with this 0A frequency. So that's what this LFO is being used for. It's because I don't have a third envelope, so I have to use the low frequency oscillator. So that's what we end up with, is this bass kick drum. And it sits really nicely in the rest of the mix once I kind of bring it out too. Okay, so with that, the last track that we have to go over is my 8th track. And with the 8th track, this is just going to be a lot of miscellany, a lot of samples, percussion. I have a break in here somewhere, and yeah, it just kind of handles all my dirty work that I'm not that I don't have room for elsewhere in the track. So let's kind of go into the instruments that are being used here. So the first one is the build-up part, right? I learned this from my Little Sound DJ days, my chiptune days, where if you have a kind of sweeping, noisy sound coming up to the beginning of a phrase, and not like a phrase in MA, a phrase like a musical phrase, this will kind of build up energy until that release point at the beginning of the downbeat. And then if you play another noisy thing at the beginning of the downbeat, then you bring a lot of cool, like interesting energy that isn't tonal in nature, which I think is the important part. So, right, if we just mute this track and try to play some of these, try to play the rest of the song. It sounds nice, right? It sounds cool. It sounds like it has energy, but the noisy parts of this really kind of add that cherry on top in terms of sound and energy, right? So that like big pa sound is something that's, I think, adding a lot to the track. And something that also adds a lot to the track are these like sweepy, noisy sounds. And so with this instrument, I'm doing exactly that. This is a build up to a release point on a downbeat. And so the way I did that was really messing around with any kind of these noise shapes. I like to use filtered noise because it's closest to the one that I liked to use on Little Sound DJ. And played around with the timbre and the colors until I got like a relatively high pitched noise. And then with the low pass filter here, you might wonder why I went to low pass the noise, and it's because that is actually what is driving the movement of the noise. With the low pass filter on the noise, I can then add a cutoff envelope with a relatively long attack, so that dictates the sweepiness of that noise instrument. Then I just have a really high amp setting into a post limiter and a little bit of reverb to kind of like give it a little bit of body, and then that's the whole thing, right? So it creates this really noisy, sweepy sound that moves over time and builds up energy until the downbeat hit. So if I were to, so let's change this to 71 so you can kind of listen to what that sounds like in context. So this is the intended effect, right? We're supposed to have a sweep and then a hit. That's what the intended effect is supposed to be. And it happens all over the place with these various sections, right? Sweeping and hitting are something that I like to do to signal the change of a section. It's not necessarily that I do often within a section unless I really need to bring up a lot of energy there. And then you'll notice that this effect is also being used. Chain 71 is happening fairly often here, right? It's that like hit. And I'm also adding it to here, right? Which is the second track. I don't, you might be wondering why it's over here. And it's because the track that I would normally put it in is being taken up by the break that's being played. So I'll explain that in a little bit more detail later. But with this instrument, this hit is not a macro synth, it is a sample, and I am using this sound that it's just like techno, oh man, I don't know, Impact Techno Effects 10. So it is a sample that from just my random techno sounds. Is yeah, so it's that one. Right. That's what the original sound is. And so I'm taking that to this using a volume envelope to get rid of the rest of that sound because I don't need it, right? I only need it for a one hit. So I don't need the rest of like the whatever's happening because it is playing for a really long time. I am throwing it through the limiter. I have a lot of amplification on it. I have a little bit of a cutoff. Right, if I brought this all the way out, or if I didn't have a filter, it sounds a little bit too similar to a snare, and I don't want it to sound like a snare, because this is a kind of an accompaniment, like a hit pattern on the downbeat, and snares aren't on the downbeat, they're on the 3, or on the 2 and the 4 if you're making faster music. So don't want it to sound like a snare. And then that's basically it. It's just a lot of amplification, a little bit of a filter cutoff to make it not sound like a snare, and then reverb and chorus happening on this instrument, creating that. And what is cool about this is that I can reuse this instrument with a different pitch and it will give a different character. Oops. I find that whenever I'm like messing with the limiter and the amplification a lot, it generally loses the ability to change the tonal character above C6 or so, right? So if I have C6 and I go up to C7, it doesn't sound like it changes very much, right? So you typically limit yourself to a fairly low number of octaves that you can change the tonal nature of a sampled instrument in, but I feel like that gives me enough range that I can do different things with it. So I have a chain that's full of these phrases where there's only one hit at the beginning of each 4-bar phrase on the downbeat. So 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's another one, right? But to change it up, I also have this this 73 phrase on the end of an 8-bar phrase, right? So this allows me to change it up a little bit, and what I'm doing is I'm bringing the pitch higher and I'm changing the cutoff on this one. So it sounds different, and then it will let me come back to the original sound in a way that doesn't make it too boring, right? So I thought that was pretty neat. And then in this part, what I like to do with these filter sweep or these noise sweeps is I don't like to have them be the same all the time. So when I'm preparing for like the really big summit, the really big climax of the song, I am going to use this sweep sound. But then at the end of it, I like to kind of copy the sound, but then change the cutoff so it's really high, and then stutter it with these kill commands so that I have this section where it's like, it's a noisy sound, but it's like, it's a 16th note version of that noisy sound. Which I think adds a lot of like intensity to whatever it's trying to do there. Then the last part of this is my break. And when I was writing this song, I originally was intending to just have it be like in half time, like half the tempo. I was putting a snare on the 3 and just leaving it like that. So what ended up happening was I thought the song sounded so slow and sludgy, and I wanted it to have a little bit more intensity and energy as it was playing out. So I created like the worst little break with samples. It was like literally, it sounded so bad. But the worst break that I have ever created sounded better than that snare on the three. So I decided I had to learn how to cut up a break, a real break. And in order to do that, I just looked up that Softer tutorial. The YouTuber person Softer made a tutorial on how to cut up breaks in the M8. So that's what I did. I found a break, which is this. So that's the break. Amplified it a little bit because I wanted it to kind of have a little bit of distortion. I didn't want it to sound quite so clean. And then I also ran it through a high pass filter. The high pass filter is there because there's kick drums in this break, right? So I didn't want the kick drums in the break to interfere too much with the kick drums that I already had in the song, which is why I'm putting a high pass filter on this. If I take the high pass filter away, there's a lot of low end material happening here, right? And then if I play it along with my bass, it doesn't sound that bad, but it can lead to a little bit of confusion with like where the kick actually is supposed to be and what kick is there. So with the high pass, it lets the intended bass character ring out and also gives me the effect of having a break in there without having to worry too much about where the kick drums are. In the Softer tutorial, it teaches you how to cut up a break in a way that allows you to use the LFO, the second LFO trigger, to find various parts of the break that give you different sections and different interesting things, right? This is how breaks are cut up using the frequency, the retrigger setting of the second low pass filter. So you essentially just take the break, it's cut up in a way that, you know, sounds okay to you, and then you just use the the LFO trigger, retrigger, and just search around in it. So. Right, and so this essentially starts the break at different points in the break, which allows you to cut it up. So I just messed around with that and ended up with this. It's just a lot of experimenting, it's a lot of messing around, and that is the main break section. I thought that the break added so much character to the song that I had to put it in. Another tip that I like to do, another thing that I like to do using these breaks is to add retrigger commands to the phrase. This gives a lot of interesting glitchiness to the break itself, right? Like I could take this retrigger and add it like wherever I wanted, you know, kind of, see. And you can definitely go over the top. So I like to add it at the end of a phrase, and it gives a little bit of like a stutter before the beginning of the next phrase. So I'm going to play this, move to the next phrase as it's playing, and you'll be able to hear that little retrigger at the end of this current phrase. I just really like having those little glitchy parts of a break in there so that it adds even more character than just the break itself. And then finally, we're going to get to probably my favorite section of the entire song, which is the lead up to the next section of breaks. And to create a little bit of an emulation of that sweeping noise sound that I had earlier, I am playing with the pitch of I'm playing with the pitch of this break. I'm adding in a reverb right? So I'm setting the reverb on this, and I am changing the way that the pitch actually works here. So normally, right, this is what it sounds like, right? But what I'm doing here is I'm taking the attack of the first envelope, which controls the pitch of the sample, and I am adding a setting to it, which is 90. And so what that's going to do is, as this break plays out, it's going to slowly rise in pitch. And I also have the reverb there to make it even more kind of like interesting. So let's play it without them, right? So that's cool, but then this is supposed to be like a transition to a new set of breaks. So this is what it sounds like with these effects in. Like, that is maybe my favorite part of the song, just because it's like, oh man, I never thought of myself as like a jungle or drum and bass producer or whatever, and this is the kind of stuff that like I feel like really makes those genres interesting. And so if we go, let's go from this phrase here, and you'll be able to hear how it moves into the next set of breaks really well. If I had more time when I was making this track, I would do more with like the variations and stuff, but I thought that this gave me enough variation in the break itself so that I could make something really cool with the rest of the parts. Yeah, so that's basically all of the instruments. It's all of the tracks that are in this track, Dusk. So that'll be it for this track breakdown. Again, go listen to the track on YouTube if you want to hear it in its entire context. But I had a lot of fun making this. I learned a lot of new techniques that I will use in future recordings and compositions. And I want to kind of take a little bit of time to talk about what some things that I've heard about the M8. So a question that comes up a lot on the M8 Discord and kind of around the internet when it comes to the actual M8 usage is whether people can produce entire tracks in this thing, right? Like tracks to the level of a digital audio workstation. There seems to be this thought that, you know, this gets you 90% of the way there, but you need a DAW to really finish it off and make everything sound really nice and dense. And so what I wanted to do with this YouTube channel and these videos is essentially prove that you can make really fully featured and really dense and complex tracks using just the M8. There is no external processing on my track on YouTube in any kind of digital audio workstation other than literally just throwing it through a limiter. If I open up the Ableton project for this track, it is literally just a recording of the track and then a limiter at the end of the chain on the master, and that's it. And the limiter is just there to raise the gain of the track so that I can post it on YouTube and not worry about clipping. But this is entirely in the M8, and a lot of people are, when they look at other M8 videos, they'll ask, you know, this is all M8, this is all on this one box. And basically, yeah, everything that I'm doing here is intended to only be on the M8 and not have to use a computer to finish off that chain to really master it or anything. I want to make a video about the idea of a DAW-less workflow later on, but I'll say something about it now. I feel like that delineation is a little bit less meaningful than a lot of people seem to think it is. And I was hoping to see tracks that were more dense and more fully featured with the M8 than I have seen now. And that's why I started the YouTube channel. There are great tracks on YouTube already. There's great tracks made using the M8, but I really wanted to kind of showcase this device and make it and prove that you can actually just make full tracks on here and literally just export them out and it's totally fine. I didn't really even need to use Ableton if I didn't want to. And so that's kind of the intent of these videos and this channel and all of that. So hopefully more track breakdowns like this will give everyone tips and things and it will give everyone ideas about workflow for how to do things on the M8. I will say that it does require a little bit of resourcefulness in terms of just making sure that you're utilizing each track to its fullest potential. But I think that those limitations are not, it's almost a cliche to say that limitations breed creativity at this point. I would say that limitations don't just breed creativity, but they are the creativity. So that's what this video is for. And hopefully you found this track breakdown interesting. If you have any questions that I haven't addressed on here, then go ahead and comment them in, and I will respond to them if I can. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'm gonna ask you to like, share, and subscribe again, please. I'm hoping that I can do more interesting things with this YouTube channel. So it would be great to have more of you along for the ride. And yeah, that will be it for this video. I will see all of you in the next one. Thank you for watching.